Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace, conflict, and the media. I'm Jamil Simon. This time, we're featuring an episode from Disrupting Peace, a podcast from the World Peace Foundation that's rethinking the field of peace building through a lens that's both skeptical and hopeful. Disrupting Peace is hosted by Bridget Conley, who is a guest on our recent episode entitled, "What Does Ending Mass Incarceration Have to Do with Peace?" In the conversation we're sharing now, Bridget speaks with Carlos Alvarado Casada, former president of Costa Rica, about what it's like to lead a country without a military. She's also joined by Jorge Vargas, a researcher of state reform and democracy based in Costa Rica. Costa Rica abolished its military in 1949. Just think about that fact for a minute. Abolished its military in 1949. It's exciting to hear about a different way of looking at national security and about what's possible when you're not investing in tanks, missiles, and drones. Here's Bridget.
Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. This season, we're looking at examples of resistance from 6 countries to see what we can learn. Scholars, activists, and politicians will help us understand how leaders attempt to concentrate power and how people fight back. Today, we're exploring what happens when a country abolishes its military. And we'll have our first former president on the show. Carlos Alvarado Casada served as president of Costa Rica from 2018 to 2022. While president, he focused on combating climate change, defending human rights, democracy, and multilateralism, which is when countries cooperate to solve problems. I'm proud to have Carlos as a colleague at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where he currently teaches graduate courses on leadership and where the World Peace Foundation is based. We'll also be joined by Jorge Vargas, director of the State of the Nation program in Costa Rica. As an academic researcher, he focuses on state reform and democracy in Central America. Together, we'll discuss what it's like to lead without a military, Costa Rica's approach to domestic security, and the ways that having a military can increase violence and instability in a country. Carlos, Jorge, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure to be here.
So I thought Costa Rica would be an important country to look at this season because of its historic decision in 1949 to abolish its military. Now, I know that many factors led to this decision, but one that might surprise our listeners is that the leaders who had just come to power were worried that the military would overthrow them. And for a lot of the American public, which is where a lot of our listeners are, they think of the military as an institution that's deployed overseas, right? It's for foreign use. And I think there's not as much appreciation that in many countries, the military is actually a threat to elected governments and is often used by governments against their own people.
In the Latin American historical traditions, armies were basically an institution to shoot against their own people. Mm-hmm. It was not this kind of U.S. army that's trying to maintain a global order. It was more for internal securities. Remember that Latin America is the most peaceful region in terms of interstate wars since the 19th century. So armies were deployed for domestic reasons, not to ensure the external security of the state.
So, Carlos, turning to you and fast forwarding to more contemporary era, how does the history of relinquished militarism impact the way a president sees security issues or the way you see foreign policy? Does not having a military mean that you identify problems differently?
I do believe so, totally. The funny thing is that when you are born and raised in a country without an army, it's actually hard to imagine what having an army is like. You know, it's probably the opposite for the rest of the people. Everybody all around the world is asking us, well, how is it not to have an army? But for us, we ask the rest of our world, how is the case of having an army? And I can see that from the perspective of being in office. Think about a country, mid-income country in Central America. For us, from our perspective, you have these needs on education, you have needs on healthcare, you have poverty that you need to tackle. And to even think to invest in an artillery or in an aircraft that might have missiles or a tank, that itself, from our perspective, it in terms of investments, it's a crime, because how can you invest in something like that where there are other needs? So that's kind of the vision which we are raised with. Next question that people will ask you is, so how do you defend yourselves? What happens if somebody invades you? But when Latin America managed to settle its boundaries, as Jorge has said, wars between nations was not the prevalent case. Actually, it's the exception. So those threats are not present in a way that could be, for example, in the history of places like Europe, for example, which is throughout centuries constant conflict between nations. That's not our case. And there's also a study conducted by the University of Costa Rica that demonstrated that there's a correlation between the reduction in investment of military enforcement and the increase in investment of health and education. We have a positive correlation to Costa Rican development. And finally, we believe that the main source of security internationally, it's multilateralism. That means we believe in a rules-based order. That internationally, that's a set of rules and agreements that are the ones that have to be respected in order to secure the peace and the stability of regions. So that's our approach. I know that for many sounds very distant. I've heard many naive, but when I was in office, we celebrated 70 years without an army, and we're still standing and we're still thriving and trying to do our best to develop our country. So looking back and still looking forward, it is a wise decision.
How do you think we support multilateralism, right? Which is the idea that countries work together to resolve their problems. You know, since the 1990s, people thought that would happen through the United Nations, which has become less and less relevant to conflicts, especially once you have, the U.S. intervene in Iraq, you have Russia intervening in Ukraine. How do you support multilateralism in a world where that doesn't seem to be what the major powers are supporting anymore?
Let me tell you an anecdote. The first time I visited the UN, and there were so many delegates, and there's lots of talking and writing and lots of minutes and lots of paperwork and lots of translation and really lots of talking. And then I said to the then permanent representative of Costa Rica, who was a senior politician, I said, is this all worth it? I was questioning the legitimacy of all that bureaucracy. And sometimes you get the sense that it's not working, right? But he looked at me and said, imagine a world without these institutions, in which the world had no forum to discuss its conflicts, its problems, to try to seek solutions. If there was not such a forum, then the only game in town will be force and might and military. So it's in the interest of all that we have a rules-based system. We blame a lot on democracy, we blame a lot on the UN, but we need to remember the UN, it's what the members of the UN and the politicians and the leaders make out of it. The erosion of trust comes from the powerful or the leaders not respecting the rules itself.
Jorge, I would love to also get your insights on that question.
Of course, international law and multilateralism have a lot of shortcomings, weaknesses, double standards. But one has to be very careful not to throw away the baby in the sink, because we have global problems where we need cooperation from different countries to tackle those problems. Even issues very close to the agenda of people who espouse nationalistic views need some kind of international cooperation. For example, all this migration and deportation of migrants and stemming the flow of migrants is not only about deportation. It's also about working with the root causes, dealing with the actors who are profiting of all the human trafficking. So it's not true that my way or the highway is a means to achieve a solution to the problems, even those who matter the most to a very nationalistic point of view. Of course, we deal as a small country, largely powerless, with all the real politics that really pervades the institutions. But we don't allow ourselves to conclude from that global institutions are irrelevant. Our existence, our survival wouldn't have been possible for the past 75 years without those institutions.
Yeah, so can you say more about why institutions are necessary for Costa Rica's survival?
Look, power can be exerted through coercion, which is the power over people, or through coordination, which is the power to do things with the people. When you weaken the coercive power, and we did weaken the coercive power because we abolished the army, we had to develop the coordinating power, the ability to coordinate society towards certain goals. And that means creating institutions, strengthening institutions that can mediate between competing interests, that can create shared agreements and implement them through public policies. If you just reduce the coercive power and you don't create the coordinating power, you end up with Haiti, which is a country that cannot sustain the policy of abolishing the army. If you lack coercive power and you lack coordinating power, what do you have? Well, anarchy, because raw power rules.
So let's go back then to inside Costa Rica and how you survive and thrive without a military. I would guess that today most of the threats of violence come from organized crime and transnational crime linked to the trafficking of drugs, arms, and people. What resources does Costa Rica have to protect itself from those threats of violence?
Well, that's a great question, because this is a very current debate even in Costa Rica, because there are some, I believe there's the few, but they manage to be loud, is saying we need to reinstate some kind of military to address this threat. But I think that one has to double click on the complexity of these realities, because you see not only that conflict can become more violent, and also armed forces can also be corrupted by the same forces of transnational crime. There's obviously a dimension of the use of force, but it's also true that it's not with bombs that you fight organized crime or with artillery. There are many dimensions to it. Yes, policing and effective enforcement is one, but also a healthy judiciary system to make prevail the rule of law. Also, prevention system in which we work with vulnerable communities and give opportunities to the youth. There's a whole spectrum of policies.
Yeah, that leads directly to my next question. Do you think there are models or priorities or approaches in Costa Rica that could be applied elsewhere?
I tend to say this. Costa Rican example is not to be taken literal, as it is. Costa Rican example serves the purpose to demonstrate that there are other possible solutions. For example, that you can grow your areas of national parks and protected areas and grow the economy at the same time, leveraging ecotourism. Similar with an army, you can increase your odds of security by not having an army, but with investment on people. There are other ways to solve problems, not only the conventional solutions that might be triggers for the problems themselves.
Thank you. Jorge, I'd like to get your view on this as well.
I think one thing is clear after 70 years of having abolished the army is that abolishing the army can be a useful condition, a favorable condition, but it's not a sufficient condition for progress, equality, sustainable development. It certainly removes a potential factor for instability and democratic breakdown, but it's not a vaccine that will solve all your developmental needs and will solve all your security needs. There is an exemplary case in point here, Haiti. Haiti abolished the army only to reinstate it with popular support a few years afterwards. Not having an army opens a new path for development. But you have to develop. You have to have a strategy. You have to have public policies. You have to have institutions. You have to have well-organized markets. And that, of course, means developmental strategies, long-term vision for the countries, respect for the rule of law, for democracy. Abolishing the army is just one piece of the puzzle. But the other part of the puzzle is innovation. Because when you are a stagnant society with a stagnant state and economy, you can rely with the army, the use of brute force to suppress malaise. But if you don't have an army, you have to be constantly innovating ways to cater the needs of the people.
Yeah. Carlos, imagine you were president of the United States. It's a little bigger than Costa Rica, but I'm sure you could manage it. Can you envision what would happen if the U.S. abolished, got rid of its military? How would that be possible, and what would that change in the world?
Well, it's hard for me to imagine that the scenario. But I mean, one of the concepts that for Costa Ricans, it's very, very distant. It's this concept of mutually assured destruction. I mean, for us, that we don't have that concept in Costa Rica at all. But it's true that that's an actual concept to balance the powers internationally. Theoretically, many argue that if that power is going to be there, it's good to have it distributed in order to assure peace. So it's more complicated than just saying eliminating or incrementing. I think both incrementing, it's dangerous, but also eliminating without having others to do the same move at the same time, it's dangerous. For example, one thing that I will hope for is to see an agreement in which big powers like the US and China that are now dramatically investing in weapons and in military agree to reduce that and, for example, target those resources into climate change and development. We live in a world that is arming itself with nuclear weapons and other kinds of weapons. At the same time, we have the Sustainable Development Goals underfunded, and we have underfunding of climate change, adaptation and mitigation. So if an alien ship will be orbiting the Earth and looks at this data, they will say, these people they're cuckoo, they're nonsense.
How about you, Jorge? What do you think would happen if the U.S. abolished its military?
Frankly speaking, I could not envisage any scenario in which the U.S. can disarm itself, at least not on my senses. Maybe if I am high, I could think about it, because it's not a problem of a specific institution, but it's a problem of changing the global order. It's a different thing when you are a small country. It's not, the complexity is always kind of perplexing, but not in the magnitude or the order that a big power that the U.S. has to deal with. So, frankly speaking, I cannot imagine in this kind of human, real world in which one can think that a big power disarms unilaterally. It just will be the food for the rest.
So it's been 76 years since Costa Rica abolished its military. And so if we're to project another 76 years into the future, so it's the year 2101, imagine Costa Rica is not only peaceful and prosperous, it has helped its neighbors in the world to adopt policies that protect their citizenry and the planet. So what do we need to do in our lifetimes in order to get to that future? Jorge, can I start with you?
In a nutshell, we have to solve the sustainability issue, both from the decarbonization process, but also from the fiscal front. The welfare state is simply not solvent anymore. It's really fiscally unsustainable. So even small countries can be bold and imagine things that were unthinkable, such as abolishing the army. Costa Rica has always punched well above its weight because of what we have done. But that's not an insurance forever. So I think we need a new period of social, political, economic, and institutional innovation without abandoning what made us different in the first place.
Thank you. Carlos, for you, how do we go from the vision today to this future?
Well, if you put the date of 2100, right? Projections are that we have current trajectory, we have peak temperature to plus 3 degrees. But let's say we address that and we manage to work on climate change and adapt and mitigate and save lots of ecosystems' lives and livelihoods on the process. And I'm confident that even though the current trajectory is not that one, we can still do a lot about that. In the case of Costa Rica, I believe one of the main challenges is to do the next leap in our development, because it's a system, I believe, that had demonstrated that you can open routes of development, wealth, education, but still has not made it accessible to the whole of the population. So how we are smart, wise, and generous enough to make the model provide for all is perhaps the critical step in our development, which I think is very tied with the world's challenges. We need to learn to live with less in terms of the material world and more in terms of the conceptual and even the spiritual world. We rely a lot on stuff for our lives, but not on other things that might be more substantial. Usually, humans, we are very driven by causation, and we're very driven by the now and by the me. I want to see my safety, my benefit in my lifetime or now. But that inhibits us to see the impacts for the future and for others and for ourselves. Sometimes when we try to prevail in the now or in the me, we are building the threats for ourselves. And there's another more contextual way of understanding things, that it's in my interest, the well-being of others. It's in my own interest, other people's well-being, peace, nutrition. And perhaps that conceptual leap is one that in Costa Rica, but elsewhere, could be very helpful in the years to come to reach 2100 in a peaceful and good way.
Carlos, Jorge, thank you both very much for your insights, for your political lessons, and for the vision. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Last year, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute put out a study showing that global military spending had increased for the 9th consecutive year, and that 2023 was the steepest year-on-year rise since 2009. Their next report about 2024 will come out this month. Making more weapons, making new weapons, selling more weapons, and using or threatening to use weapons is on the rise everywhere. This conversation with Jorge and Carlos is an important reminder that when we start from military solutions, we often overlook the most significant problems. Today, those problems include climate change, migration, and global economic development. You heard how incredulous Jorge was when I asked him what would happen if the U.S. demilitarized. And Carlos pointed out that Costa Rica's decisions are not a template that can be applied everywhere. But the example of countries that have abolished their militaries, like Costa Rica, remind us that it is possible. And once we see that, it becomes easier to recognize the folly of the current trajectory of ever-increasing military spending. We can learn a lot from societies that have chosen to advance what Jorge described as their coordinating, not coercive power.
That was Bridget Conley with Carlos Alvarado Quesada and Jorge Vargas. You can find Disrupting Peace wherever you listen to podcasts and at worldpeacefoundation.org. The show is produced by Bridget Conley and Emily Shaw, with engineering by Jacob Winnick and Asia Simpson. I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.